Hi, good evening everyone, and welcome to this Farm Advisory Service webinar, which is the 7th instalment of this New Start series. For those of you from joining out with Scotland, the Farm Advisory Service is part of the Scottish Rural Development Programme, which is co-funded by Europe and the Scottish Government. It provides a range of information and resources to farmers and crofters across Scotland. This evening's topic is climate change. Climate change, as you know, is one of the hottest topics of this generation. You'll hear so much in the media at the moment about agriculture's role in greenhouse gas emissions or about how eating less meat will save the planet. So tonight we're going to look at the gases and the emissions produced by livestock. My name is Hazel Lawton from SAC Consulting, and I'll be your chair for the evening. I'm also joined by my colleagues Jennifer Struthers and Craig Bodwell, who are working in the background, and they're going to help take your questions later on. I'm also delighted to be joined this evening by our guest speaker, Professor Frank Mitloehner from the University of California. Frank is an international air quality specialist and director of the Clear Centre. He's been conducting research in this area for over 20 years, and he challenges the claims that eating less meat will reduce the impact of climate change and that ruminants are in fact part of the solution. He shares his research worldwide with students, farmers, policymakers, the general public, and for this evening, us. We're going to run for an hour this evening, finishing at 9 p.m. We're hoping to have an interactive session, starting with a poll. You'll have the opportunity throughout the evening to ask questions, which we encourage. And remember, there's no such thing as a silly question. So don't hesitate to ask us anything that you don't quite understand, or if there's anything else that you would like to know about the subject. So to answer your poll, which is now on your screen, you just simply select the answer. If you can't select the answer, if you just minimize your screen, which will allow you to select it and then maximize your screen again. Okay, so for the people that have joined on so far, we've got 66% joining from Scotland, 11% from elsewhere in the UK, 10% from Europe, and 13% from elsewhere in the world, which is absolutely fantastic for this webinar this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to disappear from your screens and hand over to Frank, who's going to take you through the next 40 odd minutes.
So good afternoon, everybody. I trust that you can hear and see me. It's a great pleasure for me to be here with you today. Let me tell you, Scotland is one of my all-time favorite countries. I grew up in Germany, and I tell you, every time I had the pleasure to come to Scotland, I enjoyed it so much. So when Hazel invited me to give this seminar, I just jumped at it, and very happy to be with you today. I was asked to talk to you about a research topic that I've been involved in for quite some time, namely the importance of methane, and here in particular the so-called biogenic methane, which is the methane associated with things such as livestock. And so I chose this title here, The Path to Climate Neutrality, because I think that this is what we should be aiming for, leading animal agriculture into a direction of becoming climate neutral in the years to come. I thought about how to break the ice. I break the ice with you similarly as I did with a group of Irish. Earlier this year, I was invited to come to Ireland and talk to the Irish farming sector, but also the government about greenhouse gases and what they all mean and how do they compare and so on. So, and I will share a couple of slides along those lines with you that I also shared with them. Here we go. So now you see my text in Longhorn, I assume. Very good. So yeah, I flew from California to Ireland, and first over Los Angeles, you see an image of Los Angeles. And then I flew across Europe, I flew across Poland. This here is a large coal-fired power plant in Europe, in Poland, one of the largest ones in Europe. And then I arrived in Ireland, and you see here an image of Ireland, not dissimilar to Scotland, as you know. And the reason why I show these three images is because I then looked into what is the carbon footprint of Los Angeles versus the carbon footprint of this coal-fired power plant in Poland versus the carbon footprint of this whole country of Ireland. And if you were to ask yourself that question, you probably would say Los Angeles would be the #1 producer of greenhouse gases. And that's what is intuitive, because you have 13 million people here, you have on the island of Ireland a total human population of 4 million. 4 million, so much, a quarter, a third of the population of Los Angeles. But that's not really true. That's not the true answer. Los Angeles has a carbon footprint of 50 million metric tons. This coal-fired power plant in Poland, 40 million metric tons, and Ireland, 60 million metric tons. And so not just is this counterintuitive, but it's nonsensical, because you have quite a bit of sequestration happening on an island here that is very green and has a lot of vegetation and soils that store a lot of carbon. On the other hand, in Los Angeles, you have a lot of emitting sources, not just cars, trucks, trains, and so on, but you also have a lot of concrete that's being used and very, very few sinks for greenhouse gases in most sources. So, but another issue that I see when quantifying these different emitting sources is the role that short-lived climate pollutants are assigned, and here in particular methane, because methane is what drives the carbon footprint discussion around livestock, and I will talk about this during my talk. Some of my slides will be technical, I can tell you, but I will do my best to explain things in a way that will make sense to you. So first of all, when greenhouse gases are compared to one another, oftentimes people use the so-called global warming potential, GWP 100 matrix, and that really compares carbon dioxide to methane and nitrous oxide using these factors here. 28 is the factor for methane, 265 for nitrous oxide. So if somebody were to be interested in let's say the carbon footprint of a cow that emits, let's just say 100 pounds of methane a certain given amount of time, then they just multiply the 100 pounds or however much by 28 and arrive at the so-called CO2 equivalent. So if you multiply 100 pounds of methane times 28, you arrive at a value that's then the CO2 equivalent value. Same is true for nitrous oxide. That's the factor you multiply any kind of nitrous oxide source with in order to get to CO2 equivalents. And this is one way of doing it. It is a way that has been used for quite a while. Now it's being criticized, particularly for methane, and I will tell you why in just a minute. Before I do, I want to talk about the global methane budget, because in contrast to CO2 and nitrous oxide, which are more long-lived climate pollutants, methane is a so-called short-lived climate pollutant. So again, you see the so-called global methane budget here. And on the left side, you see fossil fuel production and use, agriculture and waste. You see that's a large chunk. Then biomass burning, wetlands, and other natural emissions. All of them combined globally emit a total of 560, almost 560 teragrams of methane. And here's where people normally stop, not acknowledging that methane truly has a budget, not just with emissions on the one side, but also with sinks on the other side. So while methane is produced at 560 teragrams globally, it's also destroyed and or going into soils at a very substantial amount, 550 teragrams. So again, 560 is emitted, so sources emit 560 teragrams, but the sinks suck up 550 teragrams. In other words, the net methane in the world is not 560, but the net methane in the world is 10. So this is really important because at this rate, this is unique for greenhouse gases, that the so-called short-lived climate pollutants have processes that actually destroy them. And the largest one is depicted here. You see sink from chemical reactions in the atmosphere. This process is also referred to as hydroxyl oxidation. That's the name of it, hydroxyl oxidation. It's a process by which a methane molecule that's in the air meets a so-called radical also in the air. The radical takes some of that methane, the so-called hydrogen, away from the methane and converts it into CO2. And that takes on average 10 years. So in addition to the global warming potential, we have to consider the lifespan of these gases, which in the case of CO2 and nitrous oxide are long lifespan gases with anywhere from hundreds to 1,000 years of lifespan. whereas methane is a short-lived climate pollutant with a lifespan of only 10 years. I just told you it's not just produced, but it's also destroyed. And who does it? It's done by radicals taking away this hydrogen from the methane, converting it into CO2. Very important in this complex here is this discussion. It shows, it's not animating right here, just take a look to the left here right now. It starts out with photosynthesis, okay? So what is photosynthesis? Photosynthesis is the process by which plants take sunlight and water and atmospheric CO2. They take the CO2 out of the atmosphere, and that carbon in the CO2 is then going into the plants. That carbon, atmospheric carbon in the form of CO2, is what's needed to produce cellulose and starch in plant materials. So this carbon then becomes carbohydrates, again, cellulose or starch or so, and sooner or later a bovine or a sheep or so will ingest that feed and then produce methane, either through enteric emissions, that's the belching, or through the manure these animals excrete. That methane contains, of course, carbon. And again, that carbon that's contained in that methane originates in the form of atmospheric CO2. That's where that carbon came from, that becomes methane. It originated in the air as atmospheric CO2, became carbohydrate, the animals ate it and then belch out, or the manure produces some methane. That methane stays in the atmosphere for approximately 10 years. I've written down this process, hydroxyl oxidation, that converts the methane back into CO2. And that is the so-called biogenic carbon cycle. So if, and now it's very important that these nuances are clear, if you were to have a constant herd of cattle, then the amount of methane that your animals produce and the amount of methane that is destroyed almost equal each other out. It's only the first 10 years of the existence of a farm or ranch where you put new additional methane into the atmosphere. If you, however, increase your herd size, let's say you have 100 cows and you've had those for 30 years, and all of a sudden you decide to double your herd, then you will produce new additional methane, and that new additional methane will be causing new additional warming. But if you keep your herd size stable, and therefore your methane stable, then the amount of methane your cows produce and the amount of methane that's being destroyed will balance each other out. If you decrease methane, beautiful things happen, and I will talk about that in a minute. For now, please remember the biogenic carbon cycle is one that applies to livestock because there's a balance between what plants suck out of the air during photosynthesis and then what animals belch and or their manure produces, which is then destroyed after 10 years, making it back into atmospheric CO2. So if you increase herd sizes, then you're increasing methane. In the United States, you see the beef inventory on the top and the dairy inventory at the bottom. You see since 1867, beef herds had gone up and up and up until 1972. 1972 was when we had the most beef cattle in the United States, about 140 million. Since 1970, we have decreased the beef cattle inventory from 140 down to 95 or so. That's where we are now. So we've decreased over the last 50 years pretty drastically. And by the way, with 50 million fewer cows today compared to 1970, we're still producing the same amount of beef as we did at the height. On the dairy side, you see here, 1867, at that time we had 9 million dairy cows in the United States. At the height here in 1950, we had 25 million dairy cows. And now we're back to 9 million. So we're now at 9 million, and we used to be at 9 million 100-something years ago. But 100-something years ago, in 1867, we had only 30 million people, 30, in the country, in the United States. Today, we have 320 million people, and we are satisfying their demand for dairy products with the same herd size. But what's important to note here is that our dairy herd has not gone up. It has shrunk pretty drastically from 25 to now 9 million dairy cows. By the way, with this much smaller herd compared to the 1950 herd size, with this much smaller herd today, we are producing 60% more milk. And that means our carbon footprint today versus 1950 has shrunk by 2/3. Pretty astounding. So what happens with respect to fossil fuels? Now, fossil fuels are oil, coal, and gas. And that oil, coal, and gas originated in plant and animal material that died and decayed and fossilized hundreds of millions of years ago. That fossil fuel is stored in the ground, either on land or on water, and we are extracting that fossil fuel, that oil, coal, and gas. We are pumping it up and we are extracting it that way. And then sooner or later we burn it. And when burning it, that CO2 then becomes atmospheric CO2, and the majority of that builds up in the atmosphere. Some of it will go back into oceans or into plants and soils, but the majority will build up. And that's the main human caused or the human anthropogenic contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere through the use of fossil fuels. And this here is actually not a cycle as the biogenic carbon cycle is, but it's a one-way street down from the ground into the atmosphere. And this is why this is of great concern, because we've extracted about half of our fossil fuels over the last 70 years or so. And that means we have converted that carbon that was stored in the ground into atmospheric carbon. And every time the sun hits those gas molecules, they heat up. Now, a little discussion on the difference between a long-lived climate pollutant, a long-lived greenhouse gas, such as CO2, versus a short-lived climate pollutant, such as methane. This is really important now. So let's say you were to drive a car to work every day. And let's say day one were Monday, day two were Tuesday, and so on. So on Monday, you drive your car and you burn CO2, you burn your gas and produce CO2. So that's now in the atmosphere. On Tuesday, you do the same thing. You burn again CO2, but now that CO2 you burn on Tuesday is in addition to the CO2 from Monday that's still in the atmosphere, and which will stay there for 1,000 years, by the way. On Wednesday, you add additional new CO2 to the existing stock. On Thursday, you do the same. On Friday, you do the same. So in other words, stock gases accumulate over time. They stay in the environment. The vast majority stay in the atmosphere. So that's why they're called stock gases, because every time you emit these things, they add to the existing stock gases. So how is that different from, let's say, a short-lived climate pollutant such as methane? The largest difference is that methane is not just produced, but it's also destroyed almost at equal rates. So in other words, if you have let's say a cattle herd that's constant, then the amount of methane produced by those cows, if those herds are constant, the amount of methane produced by those cows and the amount destroyed almost are balanced. And therefore, if you run a comparison over years, you'll find that methane, which is a flow gas, will stay pretty stagnant with respect to total emissions. As long as you have a constant source, you will have constant levels of methane in the atmosphere. So they are destroyed at the same rate of emissions, largely. And that's true for biogenic methane, okay? It's not always true for fossil methane that's involved or that's a result of fossil fuel extraction, because that fossil methane is taken out of the ground and burned and makes it into the atmosphere. So that's different. I'm now talking about biogenic methane here on this slide. By the way, if you have questions with respect to any of these slides, you will find references at the bottom so that you can read up about these things in greater detail. This slide here shows a couple of papers that summarized a discussion really nicely as to why the way we currently characterize methane is ill-advised. Namely, currently most people, when looking at methane, just convert it into CO2 equivalents. And they act as if methane, just like nitrous oxide and CO2, were only emitted and would accumulate in the atmosphere. But that's not true, as I just described. Methane is different. It has a short lifespan, and that's a result of being not just produced, but also destroyed. So this is why a group of scientists at Oxford University put out a couple of relatively non-technical papers, such as these ones here, the first two, but then they published a lot of technical papers in the peer-reviewed literature in journals such as Nature and so on. And all of that literature is now out informing public policy. What these researchers proclaim and offer is the notion that if we just characterize methane as CO2 equivalent gas, then we are not really describing its warming impact. And this is really important, because what we want to know from all the greenhouse gas producing sources is, how do they contribute to warming? Because we want to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade. And so we're not really interested in how many CO2 equivalent units are produced by the, let's say, Scottish cattle herd, but we're interested in how does the Scottish cattle herd contribute to the increase in warming, or do they contribute? So I definitely recommend that you look into these kind of papers here, and I'm happy to share additional references if you so wish. I will now give you 3 scenarios. One scenario in which methane rises by 35% here on top, then methane falling or being stagnant by falling by 10%, and then methane decreasing by 35%. You will see again the reference here at the bottom left. Currently, the so-called CO2 equivalent units that are arrived at by using this so-called GWP 100, the global warming potential, would predict that a rising, a stagnant, and a falling methane over 30 years will increase the so-called CO2 equivalents, but at different rates. So even a decrease of methane by 35% is predicted to increase CO2 equivalent units quite drastically. And this is really why livestock has a black eye, because anytime livestock emits methane, it's portrayed as if that were to add to CO2 equivalent effects. But what these colleagues at Oxford and many other of my colleagues, including myself, say is what we need is not CO2 equivalent units. What we need is the actual warming impact of methane over time. And that's described by a new matrix called GWP star. What GWP star does is it portrays the actual warming of methane. If you increase methane by 35%, then indeed that leads to significant increase in warming. We do not want that. And this is actually happening in much of the developing world right now, where demand for animal protein is increasing, and they're satisfying that demand by growing livestock herds. In most developed countries, however, that's not the case. I just showed you that in the United States, we're decreasing livestock herds, definitely for cattle, both beef and dairy. So let's take a look what happens if you slowly decrease methane. If you do decrease methane even slightly, you will have no additional warming impact, but even a slight cooling impact, because you're now pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. But what gets me really excited is this. If you decrease methane strongly by, let's say, 35%, then you are actually inducing a strong cooling effect, because you're now pulling a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, and this cooling can counteract some of the warming impacts caused by fossil fuel, for example, extraction and use. So livestock, reducing methane from livestock, let's say, will help us to reduce our overall climate impacts and actually provide you a potential solution to it, a cooling solution. So reducing of methane can have very beneficial effects. This slide here is one that shows to you why it's so important to use this new matrix, okay, and why we should not do what had been done for the longest time, which is just the CO2 equivalents. Now look at this slide here. The first panel shows on top emissions of CO2 and methane going up. When both go up, CO2 and methane, what happens to the related warming by these gases? When CO2 goes up, the warming goes up even at an exponential rate. And that means because CO2 has such a long lifespan and it's cumulative, every time we put out more CO2, it adds up to the existing CO2. An increase in methane will increase warming, and we don't want to see that. What happens if we hold both methane and CO2 constant? At constant emissions portrayed here, you see that even if you keep CO2 constant, it will have an increasing impact on warming, and that's again because of its cumulative effect. Okay, if you put it out today, then what you put out today is in addition to what you put out yesterday and the day before and so on. But look what happens to methane. If you keep methane constant, for example, through constant cattle herds, then the warming caused by these constant herds stays constant as well. Meaning constant methane emission sources such as constant cattle herds will not add additional warming. Listen to my words. Constant methane sources will not add to additional warming. But see what a falling emission will do of both CO2 and methane. Even if you reduce CO2, you will still keep increasing the warming until it finally plateaus. That's why zero carbon is such a big deal. But if you want to have an instantaneous effect on climate and you reduce methane, then you will have an instantaneous cooling effect. And this is why the world is talking about short-lived climate pollutants being a real solution in our fight to halt global warming. So here is a tool that I see that animal agriculture can use in order to really make a difference. And this is how I believe we in animal agriculture can move toward climate neutrality, So we here at UC Davis do a lot of research, putting animals into these large chambers or measuring emissions from dairy lagoons with flux chambers and wind tunnels. We put animals into head chambers to measure belched emissions and so on. Over the last few years, I have measured emissions on our dairies. We have large dairies here in the state with, on average, 1,500 milking cows. Some of our dairies are 3,000 milking cows. We have large feedlots and so on. And I do measure the emissions generated on these operations, and I model those. And along with many other of my colleagues, we have quantified what the impacts of dairy, beef, and so on have been. What I'm really encouraged about is that we have a situation where our regulators have, our legislature has put out a new law that mandates the reduction of methane by 40%, 40. Now that was a shock to our farming community when they did this. 40%, that's a massive reduction to be achieved by 2030, so in just 10 years. However, the legislature also decided to not use the cane approach of just using rules and laws and regulations and fines, but instead they used the incentive approach, the carrot approach, by financially incentivizing the use of technologies to reduce methane. So, for example, they incentivized the use of anaerobic digesters or alternative manure management practices. And it started just a few years ago that farmers then invested in these technologies, implemented them, and what shall I tell you, in just a few years, our methane has gone down drastically. You see here an anaerobic digester covered lagoon. Many of those things have been built here in California. Cumulatively, those measures to reduce methane from our dairy system alone have reduced methane by 2.2 million metric tons, which equates to 25% of methane reduction. I just told you that we are supposed to reduce methane by 40% within the next 10 years. We are already over halfway there at 25% reductions. And this is already certified by the state of California. We are well on our way to achieve that 40% reduction goal. And I showed you earlier what happens if you strongly reduce methane. You actually induce cooling, and by doing so, you are really providing a solution to our climate challenge from within the dairy sector and the beef sector. So I do believe that that the animal agricultural sector has the ability not just to reduce methane, but when you do the math correctly and you look at the warming impacts of methane, you will find that these reductions of methane will have an instantaneous effect on climate, namely a cooling effect. And I think it can be done anywhere. It can be done definitely in the developed world, because we now know many of the feed additives and manure management strategies and so on that can help us to reduce methane. So to me, that's a very optimistic or very positive part of my career, because I see how things are changing. And that is really good news in my opinion. I now want to share a little 5-minute video with you that we produced here in the Clear Center that I'm the director of. And of course, it's available on YouTube. You can watch it anytime or share it with your peers.
What if I told you that cattle could be part of a climate solution? That's interesting, right? Well, it's true, and it's because of how methane works. Let me explain. Cattle emit methane, which is a strong greenhouse gas. And we need to make sure we're not emitting more methane. But if we can decrease it, then good things can happen. Methane is a greenhouse gas emitted from various sources. There's fossil fuel extraction, wetlands, and ruminant animals. When we measure methane's impact on the climate, we do so by comparing it to carbon dioxide, which is the most abundant greenhouse gas in our atmosphere. But the way we've been comparing the two climate pollutants doesn't reflect how they warm the planet. And if we're talking about a warming climate, then we should measure greenhouse gases by how they warm, right?
If your question is, how do we reduce warming? Then the answer is yes, we have been looking at methane incorrectly. We want to know what the impact of a methane reduction is on warming. And for that, CO2 equivalence is a totally wrong unit.
Current standards say 1 molecule of methane is as strong as 28 molecules of carbon dioxide over 100 years. And that's true. But methane doesn't live for 100 years. It's a short-lived climate pollutant, staying in our atmosphere for about 10 years before it's destroyed, meaning it's not causing warming for hundreds of years. Carbon dioxide stays in our atmosphere for 1,000 years, building up and continuing to warm long after it's emitted. Methane from cattle is also part of the biogenic carbon cycle, which has been around since life began. As part of photosynthesis, plants capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, absorbing the carbon and releasing the oxygen. That carbon is converted into carbohydrates in the plant, which is then consumed by a cow, where it's digested and released from the cow as methane. After 10 years in the atmosphere, that methane is broken down and converted back into carbon dioxide. These carbon molecules are the same carbon molecules that were in the plant the animal ate, which was pulled from the atmosphere by the plant and is now back in the atmosphere. It's recycled carbon.
Biogenic carbon is different because it's going through a cycle. That's very different from fossil carbon, which goes through a one-way street from the bottom up into the air. If we were to keep our herd size constant, then that would mean that the amount of methane produced by our livestock and the amount of methane destroyed balancing each other out, meaning no additional carbon added to the atmosphere, and that means no additional warming.
Methane from cattle is considered a flow gas because as it is emitted, it is destroyed. Conversely, carbon dioxide from fossil fuels is a stock gas, which means it's stockpiling, or in other words, building up in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide emitted today is added to the carbon dioxide emitted yesterday, which was added to the carbon dioxide the day before, and so on. This isn't a cycle. It's a one-way source of warming. The good news is, if we manage to reduce methane from cattle, such as with feed additives or digesters, we can actually generate short-term cooling. This is significant as we try to keep global temperatures from rising past 1.5 degrees Celsius.
What gets me the most excited is that if we reduce methane from, let's say, cattle, then we are actively pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. That's almost as if you were to store atmospheric CO2 in the ground. If you reduce methane from cattle, you pull carbon out of the atmosphere, and that induces global cooling. Can it be done? It can be done, and it has been done. Here in California, for example, we have been able to reduce methane by 25%. The way we reduce this 25% methane in California is through manure management changes. If you reduce methane, you induce a strong cooling effect. So meaning cattle be an important part of the solution to reduce our overall impact on climate.
Rethinking methane allows us to focus on climate solutions, both in the short term and long term, while still working to feed a growing population. But it'll take farmers and ranchers, regulators, and researchers working together to do so.
The Clear Center here at UC Davis is also as well on Twitter. We are quite active also writing blogs because we feel that there's a lot of confusion around livestock, and there is a lot of activism and so forth, and just confusion, as I said, and we are trying to counter that with some fact-based information. So please do not hesitate to contact me with any questions in the future, and of course I'm very happy to entertain any questions that you might have right now. So thank you very much for having me, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. We've just launched straight onto our second poll of the evening, so if everyone can answer that for us, that would be appreciated. So has your understanding of the role livestock play in climate change improved after listening to Frank? So a fantastic 87% have had a clearer understanding after listening to Frank, so that's fantastic. Okay, so we'll just go straight into the questions because we have quite a few. So the first question, Frank, is the potential for transforming methane into CO2 unlimited?
Is the potential to convert methane into CO2 unlimited?
Yes.
It's limited by the availability of these hydroxyl radicals, but at this point we don't have any shortage of these hydroxyl radicals, and so at this point I would say no, it's not limited. It could be limited if something big happens, and for some reason there was something to happen to our radicals, but so far no, that's not in the stars.
Okay. Next question. There was an article written in our Scotsman newspaper yesterday by a Dr. Richard Dixon claiming that there are recent discoveries finding that methane traps heat in the atmosphere 30 times more than carbon dioxide, rather than the 20 times before as was previously stated. Is this true or false?
The global warming potential, GWP 100, has changed over the years. And at this point, the most recent one is 28. And so that's the official number that's being used. It was 25 before, a few years ago, and now it's 28. These things, they change from time to time just because our understanding of the radiative forcing and so on of these greenhouse gases changed. But, it's 28 right now.
So nearly true.
Yeah.
The next question's just coming through. Does your theory of reducing methane not then support those who would just say get rid of all the cows?
Well, all activities that humans are involved in will drive greenhouse gases one way or another. Okay, so our livestock does also contribute to greenhouse gases, as I said, and methane is a potent greenhouse gas. Nitrous oxide, by the way, even more potent. That's more a result of plant fertilizing soils and so on for crops. But on the livestock side, we do produce methane. However, if we keep it constant, we will not add additional warming. If we reduce it, we can actually provide an important solution. So to me, that is what really makes us stick out and make us very different from, let's say, vehicles or planes or, cars or planes or ships or and so on, power plants, because all of these sources actually emit greenhouse gases, and every time they do, that adds up to the existing stock of CO2 in the atmosphere. So methane is really a totally different gas. and the way it warms is very different. I strongly advise against just using the global warming potential, the 28 number I just referred to, because that is leaving out a very important nuance of it, which is its impact on warming.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm just going to fire these at you because there's lots coming through. Is it true that grass-fed cattle produce less methane than cattle fed on corn and soy?
It's a long story. The short answer is no, because in the rumen of these animals, that's where the methane-forming microbes reside. And what they need to live is roughage. So the more roughage or fibers in the diet, the happier are these so-called methanogens, also called archaea, that produce that methane gas. So the more roughage is in the diet, the more methane they produce. The other issue is, so if you, let's say, compare a corn-finished steer here in the United States to a grass-finished steer here in the United States, both of them will spend approximately 1 year on pasture. So even the corn-finished animal does, but then the corn-finished animal will be in a feedlot for the last 4 months of its life and then be slaughtered. During the last 4 months, they feed a lot of concentrate, like corn or distillers grains or so, and those feedstuffs do not lend themselves for methane production because the methanogens in the rumen, those microbes, cannot deal with concentrates. They need roughage. So the one issue is that the microbes in a feedlot environment on high corn or high grain don't have enough roughage. That's why they don't produce as much methane. And secondly, the grass-finished animal normally finishes much later. They live longer. So in the case here in the United States, a grass-finished animal lives almost twice as long as a corn-finished animal. And this increased lifespan on the one side and the feedstuff in the rumen, which is roughage lends itself for methane production. So it is not really likely that grass-finished animals will produce less, but they indeed produce more methane. But that is not considering one very important nuance, which is that on grassland, you also have what's called sequestration happening, carbon sequestration, which is plants sucking carbon out of the air. It's going into the roots and from the roots into the soil where it's stored. And that's why it's called carbon sequestration. Now, we don't really have good numbers yet as to how strong an impact carbon sequestration is in reducing greenhouse gases. So that's working in favor of the grass-finished or the grass-fed animals, the carbon sequestration. Long answer, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Okay, so with reference to the biogenic methane cycle, do growing calves retain some of the carbon from the grass, thus belching less methane and therefore CO2?
I'm sorry, I did not catch the first part. With respect to the biogenic carbon cycle?
Yep, the biogenic cycle. Do growing calves retain some of the carbon from the grass, therefore belching less methane and therefore carbon dioxide?
Oh yeah, there's no question that the majority of carbon that's contained in the grass in the form of cellulose or starch or so, the majority of that carbon containing plant material will be used by the animal, whether it's a sheep or a cow, whatever it might be, to grow, to first produce volatile fatty acids and then grow muscles or milk or whatever it might be. So that's where the vast majority of the carbon goes. But depending upon what animals we look at, anywhere between 5 to 10% of the energy the animals ingest will be lost as methane, between 5 and 10%. And that depends on breeds and so on, animal type and so forth. But at most it's around 10% of the energy that the animal ingests that is lost as methane. We do not want our animals to produce too much methane because belched methane is a net loss to production. The less methane our animals belch out, the less money is left in your pocketbook. Okay, so we don't want that. Now there are new techniques and technologies available that can help us reduce these unwanted carbon losses, these unwanted methane losses, and they look quite encouraging. We have found certain additives reducing anywhere between 20 to 50% enteric methane.
Okay, the next one's a good one. In Scotland, there's a big move to converting agricultural land into forestry. But does this grass not capture more CO2 per hectare than trees? So if you have cattle grazing growing grass, the biogenic cycle, would it not be better to keep the land in grass rather than convert to woodland?
It completely depends. So first of all, it takes a long time for trees to grow, and we don't really have that much time because we want to reduce carbon quickly. We do know that a well-run grassland system can capture a lot of carbon. Sequestration rates are very high. We have done some research in California where we compared grassland versus tree, forestland land use, and we found that the grassland system actually sequestered more carbon than many of our trees do, than many of our forests do. And one of the main reasons is that you have to consider what happens to the vegetation. What happens to the vegetation? If you properly harvest the trees and you make you make furniture out of it, then you might have an advantage there. But if you go to Germany right now, you will see that there are huge forests, but many of them are dying because there are pests in there. There are beetles in there, leading to the early death of these trees. And if you come here to California, you will see that we have not 4 seasons, we have 5 seasons. The 5th season of the year is the fire season. And during the fire season, we have huge numbers of trees going up in flames because the forests are not properly managed. And if you don't manage forests properly, then grasslands are definitely the better choice. And if you optimize grassland use through rotational grazing, for example, you can maximize carbon storage. And that is something that is very important. In my opinion, proper grassland management is advantageous to land use with forests because it's instantaneous and it can be very powerful.
You'll have made a lot of our consultants and farmers very happy with that answer. What advances in feed, you've touched on this already, but what advances in feed additives have you found to be beneficial in methane reduction?
So most of these feed additives are still at an experimental stage. So we do experiments with these things at universities, at research stations, and we find that essential oils, certain new molecules, one is called 3-NOP, even the feeding of seaweed, not any seaweed, it's a specific seaweed, comes from Australia, as well as other molecules are quite effective. You feed them in grams per ton, so small amounts. But we have seen and published methane reductions anywhere between 20 to 50%. So that is a very encouraging development. I also want to leave with your listeners or viewers the notion that it's not just about feed additives. We can also change our land management in a way where we maximize sequestration. That's really important. Maximize sequestration of our soils, and that can be done. It's not unlikely that a beef system like the beef systems in your country can reduce methane by 20% and more in the years to come.
Okay. Next question, slightly controversial. Does a balanced vegan diet have a lower carbon footprint than one containing meat?
Yes, a vegan diet has a lower carbon footprint than a omnivore diet. But it's important, again, to provide some nuance. So if you were an omnivore right now and you were to decide to go vegan for 1 year, then you would reduce your carbon footprint by 0.8 tons, 0.8 tons of greenhouse gases. If you were to fly, come visit me here in California, then one transatlantic flight per passenger amounts to 1.6 tons. So going vegan for 1 year equates to half the carbon footprint of a transatlantic flight. So you have to
our
decide.
lockdown will have helped more with emissions than changing diet. Yeah.
But there's no doubt. There's no doubt. I think that that we see that many of these people are touting their dietary choice as a great solution for our climate problem. The reason why I have a beef with that is, I mean, first of all, they can eat whatever they want, but telling the world that changing a diet will seriously change our carbon footprint as a society is simply not true. We need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels because that is what drives 70 to 80% of the carbon footprint of a country like yours or ours.
Yep. Okay, and I think we've just got time for one last question. So going forward, what do you see being the most influential part of reducing emissions within livestock production? Is it looking at grazing improvements, genetic improvements, or is it looking at novel technologies such as feed additives or vaccines, etc.? What's your view on going forward for a Scottish farmer? What should we be looking at?
It's all of the above. It's all of the above. Improved grazing strategies is one. Just leave your soil alone as much as you can. If you till it in any way, and I don't think you do, but if you were to, you would release some of the carbon that's stored in there. So nobody would, under normal circumstances, till their land if it's in grazing. But then looking into rotational grazing is quite powerful to stimulate vegetation growth on the one hand, but also get the manure in the ground, because manure in the ground will increase soil microbial activity, and that increases sequestration rates. Feed additives are something that will come up in the future, and most likely also vaccinations. I think that within the next few years there will be methane vaccinations out there, and that will make quite an impact too.
Brilliant, thanks very much. We've got quite a few of the questions answered there. I apologise to anyone that's put forward some questions that we haven't managed to answer. If there is a lot, we'll maybe try and do some sort of Q&A publication that we'll release after the webinar. The webinar is recorded and it will be available on the FAS website in the next few days, so you can watch back or review the beginning. I see some people missed the beginning. So just to move on, if anyone, now this is limited to Scotland unfortunately, there is funding available through the Farm Advisory Service for a farm business to carry out a carbon audit. So there's £500 worth of funding available for a consultant of your choice to come and do an audit of your farm business. That gives you results that you can identify where improvements can be made, and you can also benchmark yourself against previous audits once you go forward, or against other businesses, which is a really good starting point to know where you sit with your farm carbon footprint. It's a very valuable source of funding, so I would really take advantage of it because it is going to play a key role in the future of Scottish agriculture. So as I mentioned, the Farm Advisory Service funds all these meetings. They're very, very valuable, and therefore so is your feedback and comments, and they shape the future success of this programme. We will be emailing you out a survey shortly after this webinar, and I'd be very grateful if you could just spare 5 minutes of your time to complete it and let us know what you thought of it. So the next webinar, the final webinar of the series, will be next Wednesday night at 8 PM again, and this time it will focus on crops and soils. So continuing on from Frank's final comments about looking after your soil, this will be another very, very interesting webinar, this time showcasing our own SRUC research. So to close, I just want to once again thank Frank for joining us from 5,000 air miles away, and to everyone that has joined us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed it. You can follow Frank, as he said earlier, the GHG Guru on Twitter. Thank you and good night.